Topic 5 asks, how effectively did the United States contain the spread of communism? Now, this topic has only one focus point, which is the topic question itself. The key questions explored through 3 studies: the United States and events in Korea, 1950 to 53, the United States and events in Cuba, 1959 to 62, and American involvement in Vietnam, 1955 to 75. We'll break it up in this way: the nature of the communist threat and why the Americans saw it as one, the American reaction, political, military, economic, and then the key bit, evaluating whether or not the Americans successfully contained the spread of communism in those theatres. Case study 1. What was the nature of the threat of North Korea? Now, to understand why communism might have been popular in Korea at all, you need to take into consideration the time before it. In fact, Korea was absorbed into the Japanese Empire before World War I. In fact, Japan then took over China, much of Southeast Asia. Before this, the Japanese defeated Russia in a war in 1905 and won Sakhalin here. This map shows these acquisitions year by year. And this map shows Japan's possessions in 1945 towards the end of World War II. When Japan was finally defeated, the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced the Japanese emperor to surrender unconditionally. So who would move into the territories that the Japanese army had taken over in those previous decades in China, in Southeast Asia and Indonesia and so on? You'll remember at Yalta, Stalin was expected to help defeat Japan, and it was mentioned that Soviet troops could, for example, advance into the northern part of Korea, and that American troops would probably take the surrender of the Japanese in the southern part of Korea. And this, it had been envisaged, would be a temporary division in two along this line, the 38th parallel. It made kind of practical sense. Korea was a secondary consideration, Japan was the big thing, and there was no way the Americans, or there was no way that Truman was going to allow Stalin into some share of Japan and occupying Japan. After all, despite his promise at Yalta, Stalin never got around to declaring war on the Japanese, to Truman's relief by the end of it. Some historians think the reason why the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in August 1945 was to kind of warn off the Soviets from joining in. It had the effect, obviously, of speeding up the Emperor of Japan's decision to surrender, but it also had the effect of intimidating communists in Eastern Asia. This was a haunting piece of evidence of America's destructive power. The Americans meant the West Pacific to be theirs, to be their sphere of influence. America was well aware that the Japanese were on the verge of surrender, so it can be seen as an attempt, the first attempt, to contain communism in the area, to literally show off America's mighty and frightening new military power. Who and where, after all, was the biggest population in East Asia? any discussion about American containment of communism after World War II must include their policy towards China. As the Japanese army disintegrated in China, civil war started to brew up. Here are two important photographs to understand what's going on. During World War II, Chiang Kai-shek here of the Kuomintang, or the nationalists, with Churchill, Roosevelt and his wife. These people, the Chiang Kai-sheks, were favoured from the Western point of view as the potential leaders of post-war China. Chiang was a nationalist, he was an anti-communist, he was the figure who kind of upheld Chinese business, finance and land ownership. He was going to be the West's preferred choice. In this second photograph, we see him in coalition with another figure, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese communists. Why are they together? The Americans had negotiated a power-sharing deal to defeat the Japanese. So the Kuomintang and the communists, for a short period of time during World War II, kind of sunk their differences and agreed that they would have to be in partnership to defeat the Japanese. So the expectation of Truman was that after the war, Chiang would be a kind of senior partner. And remember that China was also invited to be the 5th permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Now, there's no way that Truman would have conceded that if he'd thought for a moment that China would then go on to become communist and he'd have to put up with Mao being on the Security Council. So, with the Japanese gone, civil war breaks out again in China. You can see the chaos. And you can see here American forces cheerfully withdrawing, going home. They've had enough. And here, in October 1949, Mao Zedong has emerged victorious. He's managed to seize Beijing himself, and he is declaring the new People's Republic of China. Well, where's the Kuomintang? Where's Chiang Kai-shek? The party of the elites, the businessmen, the landlords. Well, he's been chased from the mainland. And although he still claims he's the leader of the Republic of China, he's making that claim from this safe haven on the island of Taiwan. He's been taken there, of course, by the American Navy, and he remained protected there by the American Navy. You will see that all of this was to have a major significance for Korea. The northern part of Korea in 1945 was invaded by Soviet forces, and now Korea is bordered by two great communist states, China and USSR. The south was invaded by American forces. Now, remember that this division of Korea was supposed to be temporary. Does that ring any bells? Of course, it's very, very similar to the arrangements in Germany. Indeed, Korea is sometimes called the Asian post-war Germany. When Soviet officials and American officials met as a commission to organize their withdrawal, to organize their arrangements for elections, to organize arrangements for the reunification of Korea once they're gone, as you can imagine, those talks broke down. The Americans felt that Stalin was all along championing this figure, Kim Il-sung. Now, he was the leader of the Communist Party in the north, and here he is promoting his idea for a regime with Soviet officials. Kim Il-sung, said the Americans, was intimidating, he was incarcerating opponents, he was stopping non-communists organize themselves. Now, of course, Stalin knew that a similar thing was happening In South Korea, the Americans were doing a very similar thing. Here is Syngman Rhee. He's been educated in the United States. He has sympathy for capitalist ideas. He'd even converted to Christianity. And he certainly wasn't letting the communists have a free crack at organising themselves in the South. So by 1948, reunification of the North and the South had not happened, and the Americans were quick to kind of organise elections that returned Rhee to power. And a month later, surprise, surprise, Stalin organises, or he orders, I suppose, elections to be organised that returned Kim Il-sung to power. Well, it was clear that the elections in the North, the elections in the South, hadn't been free and fair as Yalta demanded. North Korea called itself the Korean People's Democratic Republic, and South Korea called itself the Republic of Korea. So, one Korea, but two governments. Well, one China, two governments. Stalin and Mao by 1950 were allies, but the United Nations, under American influence, refused to hand over Chiang Kai-shek's seat in the Security Council to Mao. So this meant we had a very odd situation that Taiwan was effectively one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. On June the 25th, 1950, Kim Il-sung announced to Stalin that he had attacked South Korea with 7 divisions against South Korea's 4 divisions. How would the Americans respond? Answer number 1 is simple. Truman knew that he could get a vote in the United Nations to support an American-led coalition of UN forces to drive Kim Il-sung forces out. This was United Nations Security Council Resolution 83. It recommends that the members of the United Nations furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area. Well, why did the Russians not vote against that? After all, the USSR was a permanent member. And as such, and the key right of any permanent member was the right of veto, to throw something out. Well, this is the thing. Stalin, a few weeks before, had ordered his representative to withdraw from the United Nations Security Council in protest that Communist China had not taken over from Taiwan's seat. So, answer number 1 is this. Truman knew that an American-led invasion would be authorized by the United Nations. He liked the idea that this would be the first time that the United Nations would activate its members into defense of a member that had been attacked. That was the principle of collective security. Indeed, it was the primary purpose of the United Nations, which Roosevelt himself had invented 8 or 9 years before. Answer 2 is to do with Truman's own reputation. The Democrat president was coming under a massive attack at home from this figure, Joe McCarthy. McCarthy was a Republican senator who blamed Truman for losing China. How was it possible, McCarthy asked, that America had simply withdrawn from China when it was in a prime position to prevent Mao's forces from taking over the potentially most powerful power on the Western Pacific Rim? McCarthy said Truman had been soft on communism. McCarthy could point to a number of worrying developments. For instance, the Soviets in 1949 had exploded their first atomic bomb. American courts were considering cases of spy scandals. It was only a week before Kim Il-sung's invasion. The Rosenbergs were arrested for handing America's nuclear secrets over to the Soviet Union. So McCarthy could claim that there were communist sympathizers right at the heart of the American government itself. A nonsense, to be honest, but it was forcing Truman onto the back foot. McCarthy pointed to the encouragement that Kim Il-sung must have had, he said, to think that he could even get away with it. In January 1950, for instance, this official on the right-hand side, Dean Acheson, had made a speech promising to defend Taiwan and Japan from communist attack. Of course, he'd forgotten to say, and South Korea. Well, McCarthy thought and said that was clearly irresponsible. Perhaps it's true. Kim Il-sung saw in this neglect of claiming that they would defend South Korea, Kim Il-sung saw in this a kind of an invitation into action. So to sum up, you can see that Truman was facing criticism at home for losing the Cold War in 1950. And a presidential election was due in 1952. Perhaps Truman's Democrats could win back support if they showed strength against North Korea. So, to the war itself. There are four main phases to be aware of. The first phase was the successful North Korean attack here, which even captured Seoul, the capital. The second phase, in September 1950, was the counterattack, launched by General MacArthur. It was aggressive. He invaded at Incheon, behind enemy lines. This successfully drove North Korean forces back over the 38th parallel. In the General Assembly, Truman even secured a vote authorizing him to carry on, driving into North Korea to force Kim Il-sung to flee and even reunify it. So MacArthur even took the northern capital of Pyongyang in November. Which brings us to the third phase, the Chinese-led counterattack. It was Mao who came to the rescue of North Korea. 300,000 volunteers crossed the Chinese-North Korean border, and this was far greater manpower than MacArthur had. And so, in that bitter winter, MacArthur was forced to retreat once again, and Seoul was captured for a second time by communist forces. The fourth phase takes place in 1951, where there's a kind of redress of the balance. MacArthur, with reinforcements, manages to take back Seoul and drive communist forces back to a line that ran approximately along the 38th parallel, but not exactly so. So the war was a stalemate for the next 2 years. And there are three principal reasons for that. One, both sides had time to build fortifications of their positions, and this made attack harder than defense. Two, neither Stalin nor Truman wanted to push their Korean allies into negotiating a ceasefire because South Korea had enemy troops on their soil and North Korea had enemy troops on their soil. Three, ceasefire talks stalled over the issue of swapping prisoners of war. South Korea was actually offering citizenship to captured North Korean forces, and the North Korean forces were invariably accepting that, a fact which infuriated Kim Il-sung and infuriated Stalin. So how did we break out of the situation of stalemate and find the grounds to end the war? Well, Stalin died in 1953, and the Republicans defeated the Democrats in the 1952 presidential election. So this brought two new figures in. Eisenhower and Khrushchev were happy to introduce their new eras with the good news of peace, and therefore the Korean War was ended in July 1953 along this line, which is, of course, roughly in line with the 38th parallel. So we're now in a position to consider the question, did America manage to contain communism during the Korean War? I suppose the bottom line is a yes. South Korea's territory was largely intact, as the map demonstrates. In fact, they'd won a little bit more territory to the north of the 38th parallel than they had conceded to the North Koreans to the south of the 38th parallel. South Korea signed a mutual defense pact with the USA and became, and is, a major trading partner in the global capitalist system. This links to point 2. The Korean War was a warning to China's neighbours that Mao could be a major force abroad. So the first Japanese government signed a treaty with the Americans that gave US forces a permanent military presence there. These are bases which, of course, the Americans still have. 3. This map shows other anti-communist treaties that were signed between America and her allies during the war. The ANZUS Pact between Australia, New Zealand and the US, and SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, are the best examples of that. And 4, Taiwan remains an American military base and partner and a separate country, much to China's annoyance. In fact, by mustering the United Nations into an enforcement action, the Americans had proved that the UN as an international organization could act as a shield against communist aggression. But was the Korean War an unqualified success for the Americans? And I think in this the answer has to be no. Truman was unable to reunify the country. In fact, when MacArthur threatened to invade China and use atomic weapons, Truman promptly sacked him. By removing his bombastic general, Truman was admitting that America's commitment to contain communism did not extend to China, did not extend risking the use of nuclear weapons. So, if he was successful in containing communism, he was not successful in rolling back communism, and that's an important distinction to make. 2. China itself received a massive boost from the whole story. Mao had demonstrated his ability to defend a junior state. This propaganda poster shows Mao being held up by North Koreans as a kind of cult hero. Indeed, North Korea and China are still important partners in the region. Kim Il-sung's regime could claim, and his propaganda machinery is pretty convincing, that he had defended his people against US imperialism. Wasn't it the case, he said, that the majority of UN's troops were in fact American, that 93% of the air power had been from the US? That is, it was a United Nations action in name only, and these UN uniforms were in fact just a camouflage for American aggression against communism. And the third point could be this. The South Koreans welcomed the UN, and this encouraged the Americans to think that they were helping Asia free itself from communism. These figures of losses were quite high, but because World War II was so recent, America seemed to accept that that was necessary. Case study 2, Vietnam. Also conquered by the Japanese during World War II, Vietnam has one important difference to Korea. It had been a colony of a European power, French Indochina. So when the Japanese left in 1945 in defeat, the French made a determined attempt to recover their colony. They were in alliance with someone who was pro-Western, the monarch, Emperor Bao. Now, this was a strategic mistake by the French, to say nothing of the morals of it. What the French forces had not counted on was that the Japanese occupation had actually given rise to a homegrown and a very disciplined and a very determined resistance group, the Viet Minh, under an incredible figure, Ho Chi Minh. Here is a photo of French colonial forces who are being surrounded and ultimately defeated by the Viet Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This was a huge turning point for the French. They realised they were defeated once and for all, and they wanted to get out. And so it was also a turning point for Ho Chi Minh, who was invited to peace talks at Geneva in 1954. Now, the Geneva Agreements will remind us of the Korean situation. At the end of the war with the French, the northern part of the country had fallen to the Viet Minh, and the southern part had remained just about in the hands of Bao and his French supporters. So the Geneva Agreements reflected that ceasefire line between the Viet Minh and Bao, here the 17th parallel, and envisaged the planning of elections to reunify the country. Just like in Germany, just like in Korea, the actual fulfillment of these elections was almost impossible to do. Encouraged by the Americans in the South, the pro-Western Democrats independently held their own elections. They were fearful that communism would sweep the country, and they were certainly fearful that the Communist Party would win support amongst the very poor peasantry of Vietnam. In the north, Ho Chi Minh was infuriated by this independent action, by this splitting away by the South. So he also staged elections. Unsurprisingly, won by the communists. And Ho Chi Minh didn't stop there. He carried out a campaign of guerrilla warfare under his ultimate control of fighters in the south. And these fighters we call the Viet Cong. And their job was to overthrow the pro-Western government in the south, to overthrow this figure here, the Prime Minister Ngo Diem, and install a pro-communist leader that might then unify the south to the north. Well, with this guerrilla warfare being carried out by the Viet Minh, would Eisenhower stand by? Well, you know very well that they did not. The Truman Doctrine said, quote, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." Well, that quote is worth trying to learn because it's the basis of this whole topic. That's to say, from 1947, American foreign policy was the active containment of communism. Now, before we get on to President Johnson, because it's Lyndon Johnson who really escalated American involvement in Vietnam, it is worth saying a word about Eisenhower. He was talking about Vietnam when he invented the phrase falling domino principle. This was the idea that if a major country, say China, fell to communism, then other neighbouring states would suffer a similar knock-on effect. Actually, Eisenhower and then Kennedy were pretty determined, though, to avoid a major involvement of American forces if they could. The Korean War had been expensive in money, it ended up being unpopular, it cost 36,000 American lives. What Kennedy had in mind was sending advisors and equipment to help Ngo Diem defeat the Viet Minh insurgents. But that really didn't work, and by 1963, American policy was in tatters. The Viet Cong, that is the armed minority of communists, were receiving encouragement and weapons from the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh. This was the outside pressure. And of course, much of this weaponry was ultimately being supplied by the Soviet Union. So the Viet Cong was capturing large sections of the rural areas of South Vietnam. Ngo Diem's regime itself was brutal, oppressive, unpopular. Remember this famous photograph of a Buddhist monk setting fire to himself in protest at the corruption and the brutality of the South Vietnamese government. Indeed, Ngo Diem was assassinated by his own generals because of his political and military failures. The real catalyst for America's intervention, however, occurred here in the Gulf of Tonkin, when Soviet-made torpedo boats attacked an American destroyer. Now, the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident was enough to persuade Congress to pass a resolution authorising Lyndon Johnson to use massive force, despite him saying, "We want no wider war." If you look carefully at this graph, though, you will see that the huge commitment of US troops begins from the summer of 1964, the summer of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. How did the Americans attempt to win this war, and was it effective? Now, this is potentially a vast question, of course, and we're only preparing for GCSE. So we'll break it down in this way: Viet Cong tactics, American tactics, and then outcomes. The Viet Cong's tactics were to avoid pitched battles in which the superior firepower of the Americans would be decisive. Therefore, they depended heavily upon 1. Guerrilla tactics of ambush and sabotage. 2. Booby traps of American troops, most famously with punji sticks. 3. Concealment of fighters and equipment, a tactic that would be essential to the success of the Tet Offensive above ground, but also heavily relied upon foxholes and even these sorts of underground communications and munitions systems. 4. Supply of the Viet Cong through both the Ho Chi Minh Trail here and also by the collaboration of friendly South Vietnamese villages. Now, America's counter-tactics characteristically relied upon the brutal use of superior firepower. 1. Search and destroy missions, in which ground troops would try and discover enemy bases, which would then be followed up by helicopter support to maximise American forces' mobility. 2. The use of chemical agents. Agent Orange was a chemical to destroy the cover of the Viet Minh, to exfoliate the jungle canopy, notably in the forests that concealed the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 3. Anti-personnel weaponry, such as napalm, to maim and kill populations at safe distance from American forces to minimise US casualties. 4. Strategic hamlets. Vietnamese populations that were suspected of pro-Viet Cong sympathies would be corralled into fortified camps to prevent them from supporting anti-American guerrillas. So what are the outcomes? Why were the Viet Cong undefeated by 1968? I've deliberately put the question this way: undefeated, because in order to win, all General Giap had to do was to not lose. That meant keeping going, whatever the casualties, and no matter how terrible the suffering of the Vietnamese, until the Americans gave up and left. Now, there are very many ways to answer this question, but think about some of these in ascending order of importance. Number 1, the ground forces of the Vietnamese were well equipped. The AK-47, here supplied by the Soviets, was known to be a better rifle than the M16 used by US Marines, which apparently continued to jam in the muddy conditions of jungle warfare. 2, the Viet Cong won the broad-based support of local populations. American presence was increasingly resented, and unless locals were forced into the strategic hamlets, the rural peasantry almost always sided with the Viet Cong, which meant that the Americans would have to capture a village not once, but they'd have to go back and recapture it for a second time and a third. And American forces simply weren't numerous enough to occupy every village of South Vietnam. 3, the success of Giap's guerrilla tactics. General Giap had been able to perfect his insurgency tactics through decades of fighting. First the Japanese, then the French, and now the American occupation. And his best example, and this is the reason I chose 1968, his best example of a guerrilla campaign was the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive was the turning point of American decision-making. Well, what happened? Tet is the Chinese New Year. Giap knew that American morale was wavering, and he also knew that Lyndon Johnson was facing bitter criticism by some people at home. So much so that he had agreed to attend peace talks in Paris, and Johnson also told the Americans he would not try to seek re-election as president. So Giap wanted to prove to whoever the next American president was that the Vietnamese were far from beaten. He knew he couldn't drive the American forces out, so to speak, but he knew that he could hurt them enough that the next president would have to say, "We can't win this war." So what did he do? He ordered 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters in January 1968 to infiltrate the main city centres of South Vietnam, disguised as farmers, officials, women, even policemen. And then undercover, from the sound of fireworks going off on the 30th of January all around the country, these irregular forces would launch surprise attacks in over 100 cities and towns. They carried out wholesale executions of puppets of the Americans, their nickname, of course, for the officials who served the South Vietnamese government. And most spectacularly of all, Giap's fighters even managed to briefly capture the US embassy in Saigon. Now, the American backlash and the backlash of the South Vietnamese army, which we'll call the ARVN, as you remember, the ARVN and the American backlash was ferocious and it was deadly. This photograph of General Loan executing an arrested Viet Cong fighter became very famous. And note, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese lost over 45,000 men and women in the Tet. But the point we were making was this: Giap wanted to prove that the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh of the North remained undefeated and still in belief that they could drive the Americans out. I think the Tet Offensive proved more than that. It probably proved that they were undefeatable. Certainly the incoming president, the Republican Richard Nixon, believed so, and it was he who was elected on a principle of American withdrawal from Vietnam. It's the so-called Nixon Doctrine, the Vietnamization of the South Vietnamese war effort, meaning that America would increase its offer of weapons, increase its use of airstrikes, but reduce the number of ground troops that it committed in the war. So, why was Nixon in favour of withdrawing ground troops? I think we can offer three interrelated reasons. First, America had been strategically defeated. We've already demonstrated that Giap's Tet Offensive tactics proved that the Viet Cong in 1968 was stronger than ever before. Perhaps 500,000 South Vietnamese now could be called Viet Cong. Nixon knew that their morale was probably greater than many American soldiers. Indeed, the voice and support for the anti-war movement, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, was gathering pace. And Nixon had campaigned for the presidency by promising that he would bring the boys home. Stories of American Marines falling into drug habits, heroin, for example, was widely used, or American troops refusing to obey orders, these were becoming widespread. It was obvious that the war could not be won from helicopters or by bombing buildings, but rather the war ultimately could only really be won by whether or not the South Vietnamese politicians could win the support of their population. And so many of them were either loathed for their corruption or despised for their treachery by siding with the Americans. Second, moral failure. Just 1 month after the Tet Offensive, American Marines were involved in a terrible revenge mission at the village of My Lai. Lieutenant Calley's trial became a big deal in the American media a bit later, and this was just one of hundreds of stories of American atrocities that horrified the American public. Therefore, the American public, war-weary with 50,000 dead by this stage, believed that the American body count, to say nothing of the Vietnamese body count, was high enough. The anti-war movement in Vietnam was driven by a moral crisis that America's foreign policy to contain communism was flawed, that perhaps it was even worse than communism itself. So there's a moral crisis for the Americans. I think by this stage, and this is the first time really in the Cold War, that very large numbers of Americans were actually questioning whether the Truman Doctrine was the right policy. The students' anti-conscription protests on American university campuses were turning violent. This is Kent University, where federal troopers killed 4 students in 1970, the most notorious clash between officials and protest movements sweeping across America. And 3, the financial cost and social cost of the war. The war cost America $168 billion to fight. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam than were dropped on Germany during World War II. I think the public would have put up with the war if they could have been persuaded that it was worth it. But when figures such as Martin Luther King here came out on the streets to campaign against it, it was obvious it was becoming too much of a cost to bear. King was saying that this was affecting the racial and social unity of America itself. He pointed out that black Americans were far likelier to be sent to Vietnam to die in Vietnam than white Americans. He pointed out that if just some of the money that was being spent on killing Vietnamese was invested in deprived black urban neighborhoods, then America's racial justice, its social justice, could be redressed. So 50,000 dead, ultimately it was 57,000 dead, $168 billion to the Americans didn't look like a price worth paying. And with this in mind, Nixon instructed his negotiators to reach a ceasefire with Ho Chi Minh. It took a long time, another 5 years, during which America widened its air war to attack Cambodia and Laos, which also had communist regimes. Domino theory, remember? That finally, in January 1973, the Paris Accords were signed and a ceasefire was reached. Here are the terms. So, we're now in a position to assess whether America's effort in the Vietnam War did anything to contain communism. Indeed, was it an outright failure? Let's start with outright failure, because that's more obvious, easier to see. For a start, the Viet Cong were victorious. They won a seat at the Paris peace talks. More importantly, they and Ho Chi Minh went on to ignore the Paris peace accords. That's to say, once the Americans were gone, the North Vietnam army simply broke the ceasefire, launched an attack on South Vietnam. Here are famous images of a panicked retreat onto the rooftop of the American embassy to evacuate staff to safety. And photos here of the very many boatloads of pro-South Vietnamese government sympathizers having to flee the advancing troops. Ho Chi Minh became the first president of a newly unified communist Vietnam. Just to make that point really clear, Saigon was named after him. You can see on this Google map. So therefore he was able to achieve what Kim Il-sung was not able to achieve, the unification of his country. With Chinese and Soviet weaponry, of course, but never with Chinese or Soviet troops. He was too much of a nationalist to have allowed that. The second point is that it was not just in Vietnam that communist regimes flourished, if that's the right word. In Cambodia, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were able to seize power in the summer of 1975, just a few months after the Americans had left Saigon. Pol Pot's regime pursued a kind of incredibly violent agrarian communism. And we haven't mentioned, and probably should have, the communist promise that to transfer land to poor peasants was very, very attractive. But in the Cambodian case, it was done with terrible violence. In fact, genocide. Something like 2 million people were killed by the Khmer Rouge under the dictator Pol Pot. So if Nixon were to have any regrets about failing to contain communism, his regrets would probably be more to do with what happened subsequently in Cambodia, which had a really murderous regime, than with Vietnam, whose population, by all accounts, enthusiastically, for the most part, welcomed the new Ho Chi Minh government. For those elements that would not welcome Ho Chi Minh in the south, they were detained in so-called re-education centres. So Ho Chi Minh was able to begin a campaign of removing anti-communists from all aspects of Vietnamese public life. A big victory for him. So we can see, if this is the answer, then the Americans had no success at all. After all, Vietnam could credit itself with defeating America, the superpower. It could credit itself as being the only country to defeat America in its illustrious military history. So are there any arguments you can offer in the opposite direction? The first is to do with China. Can you see this photo of Mao shaking hands with Nixon in 1972 in Shanghai? By announcing withdrawal from Vietnam, Nixon was able to start a kind of process of better relations with communist China, which led to the Shanghai Communique here. The reason that Nixon wanted to promote a better understanding with China was to kind of isolate the Soviet Union. In fact, the communique had a wording that said that America and China would resist the attempt by any other power seeking control in East Asia. Well, of course, that was directed at the USSR. You see, the Chinese and Soviets had almost gone to war in 1969 in a border dispute. Nixon knew that if he solved the Vietnam problem, he could offer some normalization to China. He managed this in 1972 without Mao managing to get a promise from the Americans to withdraw from Taiwan. So you can kind of argue that the Americans managed to build a relationship with China which contained the further expansion of Soviet power in East Asia and in the West Pacific. A second argument might look like this, that America's war in Vietnam helped prevent further communist takeovers, for example, in Malaya or in Singapore or in the Philippines. Now, all of these countries had communist insurgency in this period, but none of them succeeded in overthrowing pro-Western systems. So perhaps the policy that Eisenhower invented of maintaining a strong presence in Southeast Asia to prevent those states falling like dominoes after the Chinese Revolution did have some overall effect after all. It's over to you to decide. We're going to deal with the third case study, the Cuban Missile Crisis, last, even though it was earlier, of course, than the Vietnam War. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in 1962 when John F. Kennedy was president and Lyndon Johnson was vice president. I suppose this crisis mattered more to America than the other two because it was closer to home. In fact, American presidents had always assumed that any regime in North or South America would have to be friendly to the USA. Here is President Batista of Cuba. He's a military dictator. He ran a capitalist system which traded with the USA, and he was friendly to the USA. Cuba was a playground for American visitors like this guy. It was a holiday destination. Cuba was traditionally a playground for badly behaved American visitors like these people. It was a kind of holiday destination with its casinos, its brothels. It had an economy that received large American investments, such as this one, the United Fruit Company, which produced bananas and sugar. Why was Castro's revolution in 1959 to 60 such a terrible threat to the USA? Initially, it didn't seem that bad. I mean, Castro nationalized the United Fruit Company in 1960, and this was one of a series of measures which seized American assets and American investments. Over 1 million Cubans, many of them rich, of course, and had lots to lose from Castro, fled their country and went across the Gulf of Mexico, ending up in Florida. And these Cuban exiles persuaded Kennedy that Castro's regime was vicious, it was unpopular, that it just needed a little shove and Castro would be gone. The Cuban exiles' claims were less than half true, but of course they were trying to convince Kennedy to offer them military and material support for a comeback to try and retake their island and overthrow Castro. Initially, in 1961, Kennedy's reaction was economic. He imposed sanctions, ending trade with Cuba. He calculated that by refusing to buy Cuban sugar and tobacco, the island would rapidly go bankrupt. This move backfired. Khrushchev offered Castro a trade and aid treaty. He'd buy the sugar, he'd give a loan. At this stage, no nuclear weapons were on the table, but the Soviets were happy. They were more than happy to meet the old American demand for sugar and offer a vast loan to pay for Cuba's shortages. So news of the Soviet-Cuban treaty was enough for Kennedy to consider a more aggressive move. He agreed to go through with a plan. This is the plan, of course, of the Cuban exiles to invade the island at the Bay of Pigs. Now, all Kennedy was really going to offer was training and logistical support. He couldn't possibly risk an all-out American invasion. So 1,400 Cuban exiles were trained by CIA to conduct an amphibious invasion of Cuba. It seems the Americans believed that 1,400 would be enough. Maybe the exiles had convinced Kennedy that just by showing their face, the Cuban population would spontaneously rise up against Castro. It was a disaster. When they landed on the beach, Castro's tank columns had superior firepower. Castro himself commanded the forces from a tank, and the rebels were rounded up and imprisoned. So Castro wins a victory. In fact, even worse from Kennedy's point of view, Castro immediately made a speech in which he declared himself to be a Marxist communist. This was the first time he'd said it. Castro promises that he would be one until the end of my life, he said. Why did Khrushchev place nuclear missiles on Cuba? Well, this decision was taken after the Bay of Pigs. And there are three reasons, I think. And we'll start with the simplest. Castro asked for them. Castro thought that Kennedy would not just sit back after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Castro thought Kennedy would order an all-out land assault. Well, why did Khrushchev agree to this? Point number two is to achieve nuclear equality. Khrushchev was furious that America had placed nuclear weapons in Turkey. The Jupiter missiles, which could hit any Soviet city in the west of the country, but at any time. That's to say that whereas Soviet intercontinental missiles could only just about target California, every one of the cities in the west of the Soviet Union were the targets of medium-range missiles. And third, Berlin. Now, this might not seem obvious, but there is evidence to support the fact, and Khrushchev in later life admitted it, that he thought if he could place SS-5 missiles in Cuba, he could then trade them as a bargaining chip. He wanted the Americans to get out of West Berlin. He wanted to reach a deal with them. It was getting increasingly embarrassing to the East German government that there were Western forces in the western part of his capital. Khrushchev had had to build a wall a year before to prevent people fleeing into West Berlin, and this really seemed to have upset him. So the third potential reason was that Khrushchev had absolutely no intention of those missiles remaining there for a long time, so long as the Americans would trade their removal for the evacuation from West Berlin. If that was Khrushchev's thinking, it was a gamble, because he would obviously have to build up Cuban missile sites in secret. The Soviets were aware that the policy of the USA was that Central and South America would be considered to be the Americans' backyard. When America asked his representatives in the UN whether the friendship treaty he had with Castro included nuclear weapons, the Soviet officials denied it. They said, no, we are not putting missiles on Cuba. Well, that was in September 1962. And a month later, in October, the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis happened. It lasted 13 days. We date it from the 14th of October, when a U-2 spy plane took this photograph. Now, this was the evidence that Kennedy needed to demonstrate that the Soviet officials in the UN had been lying. Worse, from his point of view, they now knew that SS-5 missiles were being placed on territory just 90 miles from Florida. This meant that all American cities in the East were now under threat of a nuclear strike. It also meant that the warning time, that's to say that when you know a missile has been fired, how much time do you have to react? Well, the warning time from intercontinental ballistic missiles had been 15 minutes, but now there were SS-4 and SS-5 missiles so close, 15 minutes had been reduced to under 2 minutes. 2 minutes of warning time. This was the argument that Kennedy therefore tried to use, that now the reaction time of both sides was so significantly reduced, the threat of a nuclear exchange had increased. I won't go into a timeline of the crisis, which can be found in the books, but I will outline the most significant actions of both leaders. Now, most historians agree that Kennedy handled the crisis with skill. Why do they do that? First and foremost, Kennedy wanted to put Khrushchev on the back foot by placing American forces on full alert for invasion, by putting his own nuclear forces on full alert. He was warning Khrushchev that he meant to make the Soviets back down. But at the same time, he wanted to reassure Khrushchev that he would give him time and the opportunity to climb down. So this meant that Kennedy was resisting pressure by those in his cabinet who we call hawks, who wanted him to be really hard on Khrushchev. He was resisting that pressure to invade or to launch an airstrike. Kennedy instead announced that Cuba would be placed under a naval blockade, or American word, quarantine, that would be a 500-kilometer exclusion zone around the island. This quarantine was announced to the world. It appeared to be peaceful, although it was illegal, and this quarantine allowed each side some time to breathe, to consider their next options. Kennedy's reasoning was to test if Khrushchev would obey the quarantine. That's to say, as those ships approach, would he order them to break through the quarantine? That's to say, invite American naval ships to fire on Soviet ships? Or would he order them to turn around? If the latter, if to turn around, then Kennedy would have learned something. He would have learned that Khrushchev did not have the intent to escalate this situation into war. The third tactic adopted by Kennedy was to order the so-called back-channel negotiations between his brother Robert Kennedy, who was in the government, and the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin. So that's Kennedy's actions, which tend to be considered to have been skillful and tend to be considered to have been helpful in de-escalating the crisis. And what of Khrushchev's responses to those initiatives? First and foremost, Khrushchev did indeed order those ship captains carrying nuclear material to turn around. That was a clear sign that Khrushchev was ready to do some kind of deal. Secondly, Khrushchev engaged in lengthy and frequent telegram correspondence with Kennedy. Now, the GCSE texts emphasize the two most important ones. There were many more, but the ones that they highlight are on the 26th and 27th of October. On the 26th of October, Khrushchev offered to swap the missiles already on the island for a promise by Kennedy never to invade Cuba. The next day, on the 27th of October, Khrushchev seemed to panic. Perhaps he'd recognized he hadn't asked for enough. And so he offers to swap the missiles on the island for an American promise to withdraw their missiles, the Jupiter missiles, from Turkish territory. So that's Khrushchev's main contribution to de-escalating the Cuban Missile Crisis. This brings us to Kennedy's last action, which was clearly very important in diffusing the crisis. He ignored the tougher second demand and responded to the first demand. Kennedy's solution was this. He told Khrushchev that he would publicly state that America would not invade Cuba. But he also said, and this would remain secret, that he would remove the missiles from Turkey informally and secretly. That's to say, he wouldn't actually publicly admit that he was removing the missiles from Turkey. This was enough for the Russians. Dobrynin accepted that, and so the Russians removed the SS-4 and SS-5 missiles from Cuba over the next few weeks, to Castro's fury. So we're now in a position to evaluate the final case study. Did Kennedy manage to contain communism? Arguments for no. Cuba remained communist. It was on his doorstep. The Bay of Pigs invasion failed, and Khrushchev had managed to secure a promise, only a promise, but it's one that the Americans have stood by, that it would never again attempt to invade Cuba in order to overthrow Castro's regime. 2. Kennedy did subsequently remove missiles from Turkey. That could be considered to be a failure. Turkey was a member of NATO, and Khrushchev would later claim that this was a victory for the Soviet Union. It meant that cities to the south of the USSR were not now under the direct threat of medium-range weapons. In this case study, though, the arguments for containment being a success look stronger. 1. Khrushchev's climb down was humiliating. Castro was furious, would never forgive him. The Chinese bitterly condemned Khrushchev's appeasement of the Americans. So did the Romanian government, for instance. It looked to them as if small communist states could not depend upon the Soviet Union to stand up to America. 2. The Cuban Missile Crisis had confirmed that Latin America was an American sphere of influence. For instance, when in Nicaragua and Guatemala there was communist insurgency that threatened to win a civil war, these communist insurgents were met with force by CIA-backed fighters and they never succeeded. Russia, China were all warned off offering material support to communist groups in the American backyard. And if Khrushchev had wanted to get Kennedy to agree to evacuating West Berlin, well, that clearly hadn't worked either. 3. Khrushchev had given in to the American naval quarantine. Now, Kennedy had no right in international law to prevent ships moving across the sea. Kennedy had no right to force Cuba into changing its defense policy. Cuba had every right to ask for nuclear assistance. Either way, Khrushchev caved in, and in the end, he lost his job as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1964. Most historians would agree that Khrushchev's failed gamble to place nuclear missiles in Cuba ultimately did for his career, but was also a signal to the Eastern Bloc that Soviet global power was beginning to fade. Before we finish this topic, there's one further observation to make. Arguably, the most important consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis was not to do with America getting one over the Soviet Union or the Soviet Union getting one over the Americans, but was more to do with the promotion of a better relationship between the two. That is to say, the psychological shock of the crisis actually promoted more trust and confidence between them. Now, in the days of the 25th, 26th and 27th of October, there were a number of incidents that could have led to a nuclear exchange. Kennedy and Khrushchev might well have lost their nerve. One of them might have pulled the trigger. One potential catastrophe occurred when a U-2 was shot down over the island itself. There was another one that lost its way over the Soviet Union. And this might have led to some kind of air war, which in turn might have escalated. Another incident during the Cuban Missile Crisis was when a submarine commander called Archipov was ordered by his captain to fire a nuclear weapon. Archipov refused. He was actually senior to the captain. He was the flotilla commander. But had he agreed to, we don't know what would have happened next, but it's quite possible that the Americans would have met it with a full nuclear strike. Now, both Kennedy and Khrushchev were aware of these incidents. They were aware of the U-2 being shot down, and Khrushchev certainly would have known about the submarine almost firing its nuclear weapon in October. And these shocks seem to have given the two leaders the impetus to sign new treaties. These treaties, on the slide here, the Hotline Agreement, the Test Ban Treaty, and ultimately the treaty that stopped the proliferation of nuclear weapons, that's to say, stopped Soviets and the Americans sharing their nuclear technology with anyone else, are very important in paving the way for détente, that's to say, the relaxation of tension between the two superpowers in the mid to late 1960s. Arguably, these are very important consequences of the 13-day shock, the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. So does the improvement of relations between America and Russia matter? Well, it does in relation to our question. If relations are better, then the Soviets would be less likely to support communist movements around the world. So you could include these treaties as a sign of success for the Americans. That's to say that if the Soviets were signing agreements with the Americans, the Soviets were less likely to promote communism around the world. So to conclude, it appears that Kennedy overall did contain communism in Cuba. To take all three at once, the Korean War was a kind of a draw. The Vietnamese War was definitely a loss. And the Cuban crisis was a sort of success.